Welcome everyone to the LSE for this hybrid panel event on invisible inputs, gender bias in AI systems. Welcome to those here in the room, in the theatre, and also to those in the virtual room online. Today's event is one of many happening this week to mark International Women's Day, when we take time very deliberately to recognise the achievements and leadership of women and to raise awareness of the work still needed for gender equality. I'm Liz Stokoe. I'm Professor in the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Sciences, and I'm Associate Vice President for Impact here at LSE. So, as usual, following discussions of these kinds, the discussion will last until about 7:30. There'll then be a chance for you in the room and online to ask your questions. So if you're a member of our online audience, you'll be able to submit questions via the Q&A feature at the top left of your screen. Do let us know your name and affiliation, and we're especially keen to hear from our students and alum if you're online as well, so please do let us know. And for those of you who are here in the theatre, I'll let you know around about 7:30 when we're going to open the floor for questions. And if you're a social media user, the event hashtag is #LSE Events. We're also recording this event, and hopefully, if all goes to plan, we'll make it available as a podcast later. So our conversation tonight is going to explore gender bias in new and emerging technologies and how biases get into these systems and what we can do about it. And I thought I would just say that several years ago, I spent a year in the tech industry, and I remember that one of the women engineers, when I arrived, gave me a copy of this book and said, "You might need it." And it's called Brotopia. And it's about the Brotopia culture of Silicon Valley that both excludes women and, of course, shapes the technologies and the companies that it produces. And it's interesting, I think, because this book's already getting on for 10 years old. And even then, of course, we're talking a lot about gender bias and the tech innovation system. So very much a cautionary tale for today's AI, where we know that bias lives in the data sets that train AI, the various stages of design, how technology is used, and it's also there in those still male-dominated teams. So the subtitle of this book is Breaking Up the Boys' Club of Silicon Valley. I think we've got work to do. Okay, so today we're going to be joined by this wonderful panel of experts who are leading the conversation around gender bias and AI. So first of all, Pragya Agarwal is a behavioural scientist and data scientist who is currently a visiting professor of social inequities and injustice at Loughborough University, UK, and a fellow at Newnham College, University of Cambridge. Pragya's research investigates bias at the intersection of geography, sociology, and technology. She's a founder of the think tank, The 50%, and the author of several highly acclaimed non-fiction books for general audiences, including Sway, Unravelling Unconscious Bias. Karen Blake, MBE in the middle here, is a workplace strategist, policy specialist, and organisational transformation expert, specialising in workplace inclusion in the technology sector. Karen is a member of the government's Women in Tech Task Force, and she was awarded her MBE for services to diversity and technology. And Carrie Friese is an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology here at LSE. Carrie's research is located at the intersections of medical sociology, sociology of health and illness, and science and technology studies using largely qualitative research methods. So each of our speakers will in a moment say a little bit more about themselves and make some opening remarks, and then we'll have a series of questions between us as a panel, and then we will open the floor to you all around 7:30. So to start off with then, we'll take our opening comments and remarks from Pragya.
Thank you so much. So as Elizabeth mentioned, my work is at the intersection of sociology, kind of data science, behavioral, and geography as well. So when I finished my PhD, I was a Lever U. Murley Career Fellow in computer science department, and then I was appointed an academic, an assistant professor and I would name one of the London universities, in an engineering department, and I was the first woman they had appointed. This was around 15 years ago. I was the first woman, and I was the first person of color they had appointed as well in this engineering department and in an academic position. And at that point, I realized how much diversity or inclusivity, because there were lots of issues. Diversity doesn't really equate to inclusivity. Issues with science and tech and engineering as well. When I was writing Sway, I was examining more closely about how technology is shaped by biases, implicit biases that are embedded in people, individuals, in systems, societies, the hierarchies, the legacies of hierarchies that we inherit through our systems and structures as well, and how that impacts and how that shapes society in turn as well. So I looked at a number of examples about hiring and about technology. And very simple example is like when I upload a photograph to the passport website, I am often told that they can't find the edges of the photograph because of the color of my skin. And also, I remember I went and during COVID lockdown, I needed a passport photo. So I went on one of those photo booths, and in Tesco, I think, well, not that it's related to Tesco, but in one of the supermarkets. And they kept saying, like 20 times I got an error message saying you're smiling, and I actually took a photo of the screen because I wasn't smiling. I was actually getting more and more angry. And and the error message is, we can't take a photo because you're smiling. Please try not to smile. And I kept wondering what is going on with this. And so that kind of led me down this whole rabbit hole of technology and bias, and how these algorithms or the technology in everyday life is shaped by bias as well, like the soap dispenser, which doesn't recognize dark skin hands and doesn't dispense soap as well. And there are lots of examples of that. So I leave it there for now.
Karen.
Hello, so I have had a kind of squiggly path to here. I was the co-CEO of Tech Talent Charter, which was a membership organisation looking to advance diversity and inclusion across the tech ecosystem. With 800 members, company members, we were able to provide workforce demographic data in a disaggregated way that we hadn't been able to collect before. We closed the charter about 18 months ago because we could see the change that was happening in the space, and we didn't want to be a fig leaf for poor behaviour, because although progress had been made, there had definitely been progress with organisations, we could see that there was a real changing tide now. Many of us know the story on from there, but we could see that in the data from organisations, how there had been a commitment, how there had been a maturity journey for many of those organisations, but how that changed over that time. I'm also the co-author of the Lovelace Report, an economic study looking at the cost to the UK economy from losing women in tech, which, you know, there's so much talk about growth, the UK government constantly talking about growth, and we've got an open plug hole when it comes to the amount of women that we lose in tech, and I'll come to some of that data later on. I do sit on the Women in Tech task force as well, which is a government body that is looking to very practically support change. Now, I'm a real practical person, and so I go in with a cautious optimism. But this is for the first time in a very long time that I have been working with policymakers, and I can speak about gender in tech in plain terms. For a very long time, we had to wrap up anything that we wanted to talk about in terms of gender progression and the differences that people were experiencing in the tech industry around skills, because no one wanted to hear it unless we could wrap it into something else. So there is some optimism that we can at least speak in plain terms. So I do work at a policy level with government departments and researchers, but I also work with organisations looking at the skills, looking at organisational transformation, and looking at how do we prepare for now and next. And quite a lot of what I will discuss this evening actually comes from what's happening there at the coalface with organisations, how they're developing, how they're maybe taking some of this insight that we discuss in academic institutions and what they're doing with that on the ground. I think we have some brilliant emerging practice. How that plays out practically in organisations is quite different, and I think that we have to recognise that if we're going to utilise this moment. And certainly what I see as the pace of AI adoption inside organisations is outrunning the capacity of leadership, of regulation and of governance to understand what the impact is to people. And that gap is not evenly distributed, and it's falling on people that have the least institutional power. And I see that play out time and time again in organisations that I support. And of course, the organisations that bring someone like me in, who know that I am deeply driven by inclusive practice, they are going to be the most inclusive players. So if I am seeing that in those organisations, we certainly know there will be even more challenging practice happening in other quarters. So I think that one of the key things that I really want to bring out in the discussion today is that we know that the responsible AI knowledge landscape is developing, and it's often where we're able to speak in these environments about those developments and how we want to see that progress happen. But I do worry that the power to actually institute those changes isn't landing in the right hands. And I think it's so important that we recognise that delta, and how do we bridge that gap between knowing more and actually instituting that within the moment now, because by the time that we've created the right pipeline for people to hear and make change, those harms to people's careers, the decisions made about their lives, have already happened, and we can't press rewind, even if there was a VHS player still in service. So for me, I think it's focusing on absolutely understanding how this is playing through within the organisations that so many of us are impacted by.
As Liz said, my area of expertise is in the sociology of medicine, sociology of health and illness, and science and technology studies. I've worked much more with medical and reproductive technologies as opposed to digital and communication technologies. But I have had a sustained interest in exploring gender dynamics, genderization, that occurs in the production and use of technologies that I think is very relevant for AI as well. Across this research, I've been interested in how certain types of work gets gendered and what that means, what those consequences are, but I've also been interested in what kind of work is rendered invisible. So what does something like AI erase? What are we not seeing? What might be some of the mundane work practices that make this magical thing of AI possible? In this sense, I don't focus necessarily on women in science or women in technology, but rather how certain types of work and certain technologies come to be coded as feminine or masculine. Why is it that we see care work as feminine, for example, even though it's a massive part of life science research? And to do research, it requires an incredible amount of care work day in and day out. And I say this because we see AI largely in masculine terms. We view this as a masculine technology. And why is that? And with that, why is it that we've seen this technology develop in a way that is viewed as potentially harmful to women, to girls, and to the environment? Nonetheless, I am interested in AI as a methodologist. I do think large language models raise the possibility for asking new kinds of questions. And that is interesting to me as a sociologist to be able to do that. And so in that sense, I'm interested in how these large language models are also changing some of our methodological toolkits, and having these types of critical discussions is crucial.
So I'm going to start with you again now, Carrie, with some questions. And the first one, I suppose maybe it's a big one, but it's how and why does AI have a gender problem?
Well, I think, Karen, you may have better stats than me, but I'm just going to open with one recent statistic that I found. The AI labor market survey of 2025 reported that women have accounted for a decreasing proportion of AI roles in the UK, dropping from 24% in 2020 to 20% in 2025. They also reported that 41% of firms do not have any ethnic minority people in AI roles. So a statistic like that makes it very clear to me that AI has a gender problem. But I think there's more going on than that. I think the masculine culture of the tech industry has facilitated this culture of hype, this culture of overconfidence, and with that a kind of vagueness that's quite convenient for the tech industry, which is male-dominated, and their financial interests. But I think it's led to a framing of AI as a thing, which we could say is a very kind of masculine framing, if you like, of AI, because what that works to do is it works to erase bodies, embodiments, relations, which actually, when you start thinking about AI, it's not a thing. It's lots and lots and lots of things and people and relations. And all of that seems to me to get obscured through the kinds of discourses that this very masculine industry is putting forward for their own financial benefit. So I think that this matters because there are other ways of asking questions, of deciding problems, and deciding how those problems are best solved that also get erased in the process.
Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to add that, yes, if you look at from the perspective of the masculinization of AI and tech, there are, and I, much like Carrie, I'm very interested in this coding of masculinity and femininity and the idea of how women were considered emotional and not rational or objective, so scientific ideas were related to masculinity and men from a very long time, and something I wrote about in my book Hysterical. But on the other hand, there's this also there's a recent work that's been going on, and some of the work I'm doing in India as well shows that a lot of women over there, so brown women, are especially a working class or lower caste, considered lower caste in India, who don't have other sources of income, are actually being used to tag and label a lot of these kind of data or algorithms or AI or any queries that are coming in. They are doing this behind the scenes work, and they're dealing with a lot of abusive and violent material as well, and they don't have any therapy or counseling or guidance or regulation around how this work is managed. They get very low salaries or income compared to the people who are benefiting, men in Silicon Valley who are benefiting from these technologies. So we have to think about how this behind the scenes labor that's been going on, this invisible labor, is very gendered as well.
Yeah, I think that, this is it. We have to, I sort of zoom out sometimes, and there is a focus on what we're raising as decisions about our futures are being made without any collective consensus or discussion, where there is an agreement that friction is bad and we should erase that from the system. Productivity is the goal, no matter if that is the journey that we want to take. And when we look at things like the move to have a digital government and what that really means at each touch point, who are we counting out by that speed? And I think that comes to the real world consequences that we see for folk who are having that agency diminished as this kind of speed to harm by decisions that they haven't been able to contribute to. And for me, I think this is the difference between the discussion of AI skills and AI fluency, where we are actually helping people not understand how to use tools, but understand actually what is the function and the decision making and the data, and create that transparency so we can decide as a collective whether we want to opt in, rather than can you use this tool and use this tool and that's the metric of success. And I think without giving people more of that fluency so that they can make some decisions from their own gender, cultural, socioeconomic perspective, we will continue to run into the same discussion points as we progress through the journey that we have with AI adoption and digital government and looking at how this impacts globally. So I think we actually need to open up the kind of the discussion of should we be engaging in the way we are, and the permissive landscape that we've created for many men who are mainly the decision makers at the top of the biggest tech companies to make about the global cultural movement. And if we widen that discussion out, what powers do we have to stop it? Has it become inevitable? And they're the questions, I think, of our time.
Pragya, could you say a little bit more about the kinds of biases that are being amplified by AI?
Yeah, I think there are many. So as Elizabeth mentioned initially at the start, the data that AI is trained on, or the data sets that are used, are inherently biased because they're a reflection of the real world, and our real world is full of biases. None of us are free of biases. We all carry biases. So they're the biases of the data set that AI is being trained on. They're the biases of the designers that come into play as well. So it depends, obviously we're talking about diversity and the team, and all those things matter as well. And so all the biases that are inherent or embedded in society get embedded in the AI or the technology or the tools that we are thinking about. So researchers or academics call it the infrastructure imperialism. So the imperial colonial legacies that we all are systematically kind of living with, they are embedded within the technology. So I talked a little bit about how some of the tools that we use every day doesn't recognize different skin color, but there's also the Gender Shades project that researchers at MIT were doing, and it found that the facial recognition system, for instance, has a 35% error in recognizing darker skinned women compared to 0.8% white-skinned men. And so that's just one example of how facial recognition systems have a huge amount of racial and gender bias. And all these biases are intersectional. So we can't say there's a gender bias or racial bias. There's a whole notion of intersectionality in it. So the biases get compounded. So brown-skinned or black-skinned women are more likely to be discriminated against in technology, because at different levels, whether they are working in it or not, or whether they are using the technology or tools. So these kind of intersectional biases really play a role in it. So for instance, in the hiring, we had a case where Amazon was using AI to monitor and a lot of companies now are using AI to filter out CVs, and they look for certain keywords. And so without human intervention, it's just a black box, basically. It's just using the previous data that it's learned from. And so they found that they were monitoring these CVs, and they were taking out anything which had women in it, for instance, because the previous data that they had been trained on had told the AI that women weren't suitable or as skilled at this job, or anything that were related to women. So if they were part of a women's basketball team, they would pick that keyword up and filter it automatically. So that those kind of biases is something that's happening all around us. And what is happening with AI, I feel, or tech, is companies and organizations, obviously there's a shortage of skills and shortage of human power, but also it is often felt that these technology would be more objective or rational or remove some of the human biases. But what they're doing is just amplifying and compounding some of the biases that are already existing within our system and in our data sets.
I I wanted to ask you if you wanted to say anything more about the English language bias as well.
I mean, I cannot use voice recognition systems because I have an accent, and so there's a certain dialect. So the thing with these tech are they're built around certain norms. Okay, so that is these ideas of what is the gender bodies, the gender voices, the gender gestures, and they create their norms, use these norms to create this technology. And these norms are used as templates. So anything that deviates from this norm, the technology is not going to work very well. It's not created for that. So which means that it marginalizes people further, who are not the norm. So any received pronunciation or any proper English dialect or English accent is okay, but anything that's away from the norm is pushed further to the fringes. So what these technologies are doing, in my view, are actually creating more divides and more marginalization and more othering, basically. They're othering people who are already being othered in society.
Maybe in a related, another spin on the same kind of topic, Karen. So the workforce that's currently building AI is itself shaped by gender bias. So what might that mean for everything that the system is producing?
Yeah, we can't ignore the fact that the tech workforce is 80% men, and the progress in terms of representation has been very slow. Obviously, the tech workforce has grown significantly, but that representation rate has been stubbornly slow, between 16 and 20% over the last 5 to 7 years. And that really varies by role. So there is quite a hierarchy in terms of what roles are almost accepted to have a higher propensity for female technologists, and some of them are around sort of safety. So we know the lowest is things like telecom engineering, which is about 6% of women. So we can't escape the fact that we already have a landscape that is massively skewed. Beyond that, we're losing between 40 and 60,000 women a year from tech who step out because of unfair progression pathways and processes, having unequal pay, and the culture that they're having to kind of navigate within an organisation. And that's an enormous amount of women stepping out because of those factors. When we look at the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in the number of men in tech. That's increased by about 11.5%, and a decrease of 7% of women. So we are not able to replace at a rate that we're kind of losing women, and that costs the economy between 2 and 3.5 billion. So a significant amount in that churn and that loss of institutional knowledge, but also in terms of what that means for females' kind of participation in the tech landscape. And we've heard those challenging stats around the kind of the slowing stagnation and actually the reduction of the number of women working in AI. And this is a story that we've heard time over time, where we see power starting to be redistributed in the opportunities that we have in certain tech functions. We see a compression in the number of women in those functions, because actually there's a recognition that there is more to gain, and because of many of the structures that we have within our tech organisations, they are looking for more masculine presentations for measurements of success. So that we start to see these shifts, and we're seeing that in AI roles in the UK as well. What I think I find interesting about this space is, well, interesting and frustrating in equal measures, is we are already seeing some of the behaviours play out in AI adoption. So when we look at things like a competency bias, we know that women are judged more harshly than their male colleagues when they use AI tools. So what where we see that is at every new frontier that we're finding, there's a new way to judge women a little bit more harshly. So women using the same tools as their male colleagues are judged to be less competent because they have used those tools. And that swirls around my head a million times, that we continue to find those frontiers to judge women more harshly than men. How can we succeed with that landscape? And we're seeing that play out in different ways. There's been a few studies that have confirmed that this is definitely happening, but I've seen it on the ground, the way that folk talk about it, even from the mix of actually using tools that are coding all the way to sort of productivity tools, where an organisation is actively encouraging something like Copilot, for example, and managers are criticising that use because it's slightly less sophisticated than a male colleague who they are celebrating for that use. So we're seeing how those kind of practical illustrations are playing through. And when we start to prevent a play space for women to develop those skills and feel that they can use them in the aid of their work and their sector and where that feels most valuable, we start to condense how confident we feel in actually the use of that technology and making sure that we can have a viable voice in that space. And we're seeing that kind of play through across the piece. But alongside that, it's been really interesting to see that when we're looking at the ethics space and the AI ethics space, that is almost being seen as a permissive space for women to play in. Come tell us how to use AI, but where's the power actually in the AI ethics space? There's loads of great advice, frameworks. We know how to approach responsible AI adoption, but where are we seeing that in terms of actually outcome? How are we holding boards to account for that where there's failures? And it's interesting to see that that is a play space that we're very happy to have women in. And I can't help but feel like it's a new type of office housework. We've created you're here, you're in the space, so we can count you in when we need to do these pesky reports, but where is the power to shape? And I see so many frustrated individuals who are trying to work within organisations. They've been given the mantle of AI ethics. They are working very hard, and some are really doing very good work, and that's not to diminish that work at all. But when actually there is difficult decisions to make and there's friction, actually that illusion of power starts to diminish because they're not able to instruct, take that authority, hold feet to the fire. And so, it's a curiosity for me right now in terms of how that space is developing, what that's going to look like in the next couple of years. Are we going to sort of see a rebalancing or more power gifted there when we think about kind of regulatory changes? I'm not sure, but it is interesting that that's the door that we've left open. So I think there's a lot for us to consider, that we know the workforce that we're pulling from here has got a intrinsic problem with representation. The culture has never really found its inclusive feet. And now the way we're seeing this play through in decision making with different AI adoption and tools and development, we're seeing those patterns play out again. Which, I guess if we think about what AI does is exactly what we'd expect it to do. It's found the pattern, it's playing it through exactly by that playbook.
Carrie.
I wanted to ask you about how ethics is conceptualized, because I would say in the medical field, we have somewhat succeeded in arguing that ethics needs to be thought about from the very beginning.
Yeah.
It can't be tacked on at the end. And we've seen this critique of the diffusion model, that we can't just think the ethics of technologies just when it's used, it starts at the beginning. How are they viewing this feminization of ethics? Is it?
I think there's, actually, in an odd way, in the kind of inception point and when everything feels quite green fields. There's lots of, those concepts are important. Yes, we absolutely value that contribution. What we see is that when that plays through and when we get to those friction moments, that's where there isn't the power or authority to push through and actually say, well, no, we have to ensure this. Or there's, those forgettable moments as well. I also find that we're seeing very organic implementation. So we're finding that, and it's important that we have pilots because we do need the proofs of concept, but they're finding a way to kind of almost circumnavigate your normal procurement processes, which means that you're not getting that opportunity to always ensure that you've got that input first up, and then it's in play, and then you're trying to bolt on, and you become part of a problem space because you're trying to slow. Everyone's using it, and look at it, it's fine, and it becomes really difficult, especially if you're only one voice, and this varies in terms of remit, where you sit in the organisation and what kind of power you have on this. But we're definitely seeing that the contribution level at that first stage, it's great. Mm-hmm. But actually how that plays through to outcomes is really variable.
Right. So it's there and then it gets diminished.
For sure.
I wonder if how much of all this that you are talking about is inherently linked to this idea that ethics and regulation, as you're saying, is not considered something that has any power at the moment, and so it's hard science and soft science kind of a thing. So one is a very masculine technological space, and the other is something, as you're saying, the housework, the invisible labor, the emotional, mental labor that women perform often in offices. But it's also that idea that women are there to do the less sexy work, or the work that is often unpaid or unpaid. So I'm just thinking how much of that is linked to this idea that this regulatory aspects or ethics is just kind of tacked on as an afterthought, and it's not really seen as the sexy important work, and so the women are there to educate. So as a lot of work I do with organizations, I see that women or minoritized people do a lot of the education or educating other people, teaching other people, organizing things, organizing these diversity inclusivity initiatives. And that's kind of work it's seen as. So I'm just thinking whether that divide is really still there.
I think it really is. And it's interesting. I do see a lot of adjacency with the work that many DEI colleagues have done over the last 10, 15 years, and how that had some momentum. We saw some additional, some not really quite regulation, but some some frameworks and support and that momentum, and we saw that be more deeply instituted. And then we've seen that wane, we've seen the criticism, and I think in part we're seeing that there may be a similar journey there. The difference between the UK and the EU on this, and how we're kind of seen as innovation first. I think it's a really difficult space if you're in the AI ethics space and you're coming along. You are being the squeaky wheel, and so it's how you create that and storytell that this is a valuable, needed, this will be, this will prevent significant challenges further down the line. But I've been in rooms where someone's very excitedly telling me about something they've just developed and they're thrilled. And one example sticks in my mind because I just thought, oh gosh, this is a fun one. Let me tell you about it. So this is a great new tool, and they fixed it. So what they're going to do in terms of their measuring people's performance and making sure it's super fair, really fair, we're going to make sure that we're taking out that variable, pesky risk of middle management. And what we're going to do is we're going to start measuring people's contributions in meetings, and that be a metric. My favourite bit, and measuring their eye contact through the meeting. And that's going to be one of those metrics that we're going to bring in, and we're going to say, this person is really on it. They're contributing, not what they're saying, but they're contributing all of the time. They're looking at you, and that's really great. And you can imagine, I was like, go on. Where do you think this is like? What? Are you, and I was like, have you neurodivergence? Let's just start there, and we'll kind of go from there. And they were very cross, and this was a very big tech brand, and I made light of it. They were furious with me because this was a minuted meeting, and I said, you are breaking equalities laws. You cannot do that. And they were furious with me. And I said, you should be thanking me. I've saved you hundreds of thousands of pounds in legal fees. They were not thankful for me. And I was absolutely out of the door. But people are innovating in this way all the time. Who's in that room saying, oh, well, 1 second now, is that the right way for innovation? And, if I was part of that company, would I have felt that I could speak up in that way? I mean, I was, I'm an upstart, so I had no problem sort of saying, no, that's dreadful. But you can see the kind of political capital that you have at risk voicing those concerns. So who do we allow that power? Who do we make sure is the kind of the guardians in those spaces? Because the next step of that is that there was no plan to tell staff that is how they're being measured. How do you protect yourself when you miss that promotion? Because, you're not intensely looking at someone. And that's my real fear. And I think it goes back to that same piece is how do we make sure that this is an everyone call to action, that we're holding to account, that we're protecting those, not just who's not in the room, but also our kind of future selves. In this, I say that quite a lot about disability. Age-acquired disability, unfortunately, comes for most of us, and so many folk feel that they don't need to be active in the inclusion space because they'll never be affected. They'll never get old. They'll never be sick. They'll never need that support. And so I think that sort of plays through in all of our ethics kind of work at it as well.
Gosh, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
We're in a university setting, and at least three of us, I suppose, are in a university setting. So, Carrie, I'll come to you first to maybe say something about why does the gender problem of AI matter for a social science institution like LSE?
There are new tools. They allow us to ask new questions. But as a researcher, I don't have a good answer to a potential funder who asks, okay, you're using LLMs, but this is rooted in a model that we know is biased. So the only way to respond to that question is that we will then have to show the biases of the model through our research in a way that where our research doesn't become test material for corporations. And so there's a big call for efficiency, but this feels very inefficient to me, I have to say. And so I think I feel quite stuck as a researcher in that respect. I do think we can surface, and we've done a lot of, we know that the material on the internet that trains these models is biased, and so the models that you work with are then biased. We know this, but that then has to become part of our analysis. And I struggle with that as a researcher.
I see a few things. So firstly, intellectual copyright is a big issue. As a writer, a lot of authors, their books have been used without their consent for training these data sets. So there's no regulation around it, policy around it. And so that is something we need to be concerned about or thinking about, or as an academic community, as a writer community, as a literary community, whatever, we need to be talking about it more to put pressure on those who are making these policies to protect intellectual copyright. I do think that. Secondly, I do think that while there are some obviously pros to large language models and AI tools in terms of analysis of large data sets and the efficiency it can provide. We do need to understand the role of critical thinking that sometimes I think in education we are missing at the moment, and I see that while teaching as well, that these tools can be used so quickly that they can remove some of the challenges of writing and researching for people, and so it's seen as an easy way out. But we do know that there are mistakes embedded in these algorithms and models. We know that recently I was talking to a colleague who's reviewing a paper, and he realized that he hadn't come across this reference before, although he knew the field really well, and he looked up the reference and it didn't exist. It was an artificial reference in the paper that he was reviewing. There were 5 other references that were not there, that were not existing. So the paper had been written with the help of some ChatGPT or something, and it was done to collate the vast amount of information, but it had also created artificial references in it as well. So I do feel like we need to be aware of the errors and the mistakes that can become amplified by this. And if this paper gets published or gets through, then those references are in the domain, academic domain. So I think while we have this conversation about whether it's okay to use AI within our academic work, in our research, we need to also have a conversation about how do we use them and where do we use them. Not every application is okay for it to be used. Where the problems can arise, what are the loopholes, what are the bottlenecks. I think we have to go in very clear-eyed in it, I feel.
I would just say on that as well, I think that, I do, which is different to academic study, of course, but there's the hunger for business intelligence, and I see this kind of more widely, how quickly we're kind of chomping through those insights. That kind of speed, I do wonder if it's actually adding anything to our understanding, our development, the depth, and I think that hunger for the next thing, more, I think both feeds the need for supportive tools, but equally, we're living in a more shallow insight knowledge economy potentially. I'm constantly seeing the conversation around we can do that, but we need a report on it, and so people smash something together quick, and then that thing happens, and then someone goes, oh, actually no, that was all made up, but actually we made a big decision, and now we've just made 60 people redundant because of that decision, but oh well, we'll just brush that away and we'll run on. And I think that it's that I'm fascinated by how we remove friction from all of these processes, all of our thinking, all of, and where the benefit for some of that is. And absolutely there's processes where that is well worth it, but there's not a choice in where we're removing some of that friction. And I think that plays through in the academic space as much as in the kind of business intelligence space, and how that gets us to better outcomes. I've got a big question mark over.
We're sitting here in the context of International Women's Day. Carrie, what would a feminist approach to AI look like?
I would start by saying a feminist approach to AI would not be, it wouldn't start with profit as its key indicator of success. I think feminist AI would not seek scalability as its other indicator of success. I think a feminist approach to AI would ask how we can build gender equality, anti-racism, anti-ableism into our systems when we have this biased data. We live in a biased society. And so it would try to create a different kind of infrastructure that made the variable actors involved and implicated by it central and visible and consulted. I think it would start with what problems are we trying to solve? Whose problems are they? and who might question this framing of the problem and not view that as a hostile, critical, but as something that is generative and actually generous.
Do you want to say something else about that?
I think potentially a higher level of transparency. I think that would perhaps be where we land. Would it be as directive? I don't think it would. I think there would be more variance potentially in output. Would it be as sycophantic? I don't know. I think that potentially, would we want that to be designed out? How we position some of the interface, I think, has been feminized because of the historical view of service and women in service. Would a feminist model course correct on that? But I definitely, many questions I have open in my mind on that, but I absolutely would see that being a more transparent model, more variable output.
I think a feminist approach would be inclusive and intersectional and need to keep at the heart of it that this technology is to be used by humans and for humans. And I think the whole idea of classification and categorization is inherently very colonial, and those kind of embed binary categories or norms within AI, which actually is a huge problem because it genders, as I said earlier, it genders the bodies that are using it, but also the bodies that are being used for training and the acts and the gestures. So I think it has to move away to a different model, which is more collaborative, which is more emerging from the community itself. It needs to remove the hierarchies within the technology and within the space that's designing the technologies. And so some of the misogynistic ideals that are being embedded in like humanoid robots or voice recognition technologies or even other things, we need to think about different form of epistemologies of knowledge which are being ignored in the technology space at the moment. I think that's what I think of feminist AI.
It feels almost hackneyed to say it, but I presume a feminist AI wouldn't call it Alexa.
No,
Siri
or
either.
Siri. Yes, exactly.
Before we open the floor to questions from the audience, I thought I'd ask you a question about the future. When we all arrived in the green room earlier, we noticed that we'd all turned up in black. And we were like, but we're trying to end on a more sort of positive note, maybe. So let's just think about the future a little bit. Maybe you can address any of these sort of points in your final remarks. So something about developments in AI that might be more positive, or innovations that you're seeing that are a bit more positive. And certainly for younger generations, and I'm sure there are a lot of students in the audience here, especially women and underrepresented groups, what inspires you about the role that they can play in shaping the next generation of AI? So anything future-oriented that changes us immediately into brightly coloured clothes. Let's start with Carrie.
Okay. So I think the benefit of the insight that all technologies have politics built into them is that we could build a different politics into these technologies. And we are seeing alternative ways of building these models. My colleague Noor Chamaris sent me an article about the University of Amsterdam that developed their own Gen AI tool, but it was created by their internal staff, and with the goals of providing equitable, privacy-preserving access for students and staff, with education and learning at the center. So, we can rewrite these scripts. The other thing that gives me hope is we have seen really reductionistic technoscientific projects happen before. And it seems to me that almost always the outcome is that these really reductionistic definitions of what it means to be human or what it means to be intelligent in pursuing themselves, show just how reductionistic they are and open up to far more complex models. So the Human Genome Project didn't show us that there was a gene for everything, or that we were completely determined by our genes, but rather that things were much more complicated, and there's epigenetics and neuroplasticity in the microbiome.
So if I was speaking to, maybe folk that are stepping into their careers, I'm not starry-eyed, but this is a mass disruption moment, and there is a shape for you in that. Why do we need to imagine that has to be a catastrophe rather than the opportunity to course correct so much that we don't agree with in what's gone before? So I would say, this is a moment to be purpose-driven, to be intentional about what you want to do with this moment of technology. And I see, we've spoken about some of the harms in AI, but I also see the wonderful things that have been achieved, and I am thrilled. I love tech. I'm a data geek, and I enjoy seeing how we are doing things that are changing people's lives in a way we couldn't have imagined. And, I do an enormous amount of work with disabled young people. And actually the doors we're opening with some of this tech is ones that have been locked closed for far too long. So I would say that actually we have a breadth of younger people stepping into careers that perhaps they couldn't have in the past. But this is a question for all genders to take in their purpose and to use this mass disruption moment to carve something different and, allow for that purpose to have some shape. So, I am excited, and I will continue to be a, cautious optimist in this space, because we have to, if we just expect that nothing can change here and we will continue to tread only one singular road, we will not be able to change things. And there's brilliant minds in this room that will shape things differently. So, I want to see what you will do to make a difference and find your purpose in this space. So, yeah, I think just walk that path and don't let that be pre-described on what's happened before.
I didn't dress in completely black, so I'll break it. I think that, yes, I think there has to be a note of optimism, but and I am quite hopeful to see the communities that are coming together now to think about good AI, good technology, social impact of these technologies, and gender theory being applied to AI, queer communities, trans communities coming together to think about how these technologies are not trans-inclusive, or they're not taking into consideration non-gendered forms of identity. And so I'm really optimistic about those kind of initiatives. I'm optimistic about some of the proactive bias mitigation tools that are being designed now. There are limitations to that, but there is a discussion happening. There is also a growing awareness and discussion of where these tools can be applied, what they can be good for, but things they cannot be good for. So they cannot be good for creative expression or human creativity. If you want something that can be replicated, that has been done before, they're fantastic. But if you want something new and innovative, they cannot be good for that, because that is part of being human. So yeah, I think I feel hopeful that there is a lot more to do, but we are having these conversations.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for this discussion that we've had. So it's now time to open the floor to questions. And I know we already have some online, but maybe we'll start in the room. If you could include your name and affiliation, and I'll take a couple at a time. So I can see a hand here at the front, and also a hand, yes, you with the black jumper, I think, or dark jumper, yeah.
Hi. My name is Nisreen, and I'm not affiliated with any corporate. I am part of a group called Represent AI, which is a group that tries to help women be represented in AI. Hi, Karen. All the notes that I took, so I took a lot of notes, but I then put in brackets some of my raw thoughts. And Carrie, when you talk about if, a feminist approach would be, women would consult on what problems are there and how we address them. And then, I think, Pragya, you talk about the content moderation done by Indian and actually Kenyan women. Karen, you speak about this weird performance management idea. And really all my notes speak to something, like at the moment, AI is rapidly being developed because of the notion that if we don't develop fast enough, a national enemy is going to develop first. Very, very masculine. Yeah. Content moderation, I'm thinking of men typically are the bosses and the women are, in middle management, senior leadership is not that attainable. Middle management is very much so. I think that's the progress we made. I'm thinking of, female adoption of AI being lower because they're wary of tech, because, there's just this ongoing masculine energy. So I'm curious, because I'm very heartened to see a lot of men and young men in the crowd. I'm curious if you've seen any difference generationally, and whether actually our men and young men are aware of this. Like, we talk about it easily amongst us women. We can pinpoint it, we can say we lived it in one form or another. Have you seen a sense of awareness within our men, young men, be different by generation?
And there was one other here. Yeah.
Hello, good evening panel. I am Ishita. I'm a postgrad student at UCL. And I would like to carry the same question. I had similar thoughts that I was reading recently that how Gen Zs are becoming more conservative in nature, reinforcing more gender stereotypes. And Gen Z also becomes the largest pool of tech users and AI users. At the same time, you also see a lot of crime rates going up and AI generalizing how a woman should look like, how a particular race should look like, how should women behave. So quick thoughts on, do you see any interlinkages here, and what does the future hold in this regard? Thank you.
I'd like to go first. Karen.
So, yes, I do see that, but I also am wary of us playing to the stereotypes of even how we're seeing that show up, because absolutely I'm seeing some of the pushback, but also some of the advancement in, senior men in organisations. I'm seeing some difficult conversations emerge with young men, but then equally I do some work with a pupil referral unit, and lots of the folks there are men, or young men. And actually, some of the conversations that we've had that have really spin my mind on how we're trying to organise a society that's changed without a consensus around where we're trying to land with that. And so many of those conversations recognise and feel fearful about actually the direction of technology. Now, if we counted those in a study or around demographics and looking, actually those voices would be silenced in those numbers. So I want to ensure that we don't fall into the poor behaviour of sort of saying young men think this, old men think that. Actually, what do individuals feel, and make sure that we're giving that attention to how do we have better conversations together about challenging problems in our communities, about our technology use. Actually, and it goes to the point that I find around the fluency, make sure that we actually are, there's a reason why there is a focus on use our tools rather than we'll tell you how they work, because that gives a different power to society. And so for me, I think I just have a slightly different problem statement that I'm looking to work through, because I see so many men of all ages being alarmed about these challenges, fighting hard to see difference in different parts of our communities, in our organisations. And I don't want their voices to be silenced because we're going to kind of binary studies about this generation say that. And so I think it's a more complex kind of argument, but welcome others' thoughts.
I think those are really valid questions and comments, and what Karen said, I think equally is really interesting. I would say that I think sometimes there is still a tendency that anything to do with gender equality is a woman's problem. So I think the women have to talk about it, but then we are just talking to an echo chamber because we all know what the problem is, and what most of us anyway. And recently I gave a talk about women in STEM. I was invited to do a keynote, and there were 80 people in the room. At a university, only 2 were men. And I got actually quite annoyed about it, because it's like, what is the point of having these conversations? So I do think that these spaces, I think it's not just about being allies. It's about realizing that the notion of equality or notion of this injustice equally applies to everybody, no matter whether you're part of that identity or not. And yes, we shouldn't subscribe to stereotypical binary views, because there are lots of young men who are really interested and keen to do this, and equally there might be older men. I think we need to talk about the culture as a whole, about where is this kind of stereotypical norms or gendered ideas coming from. And we know from research that even by the age of 9 or 10, girls start believing that they're not as good at science and maths as boys are. And this is, boys believe that and girls believe that as well. And I think that starts this idea of this notion that of the hierarchies or of these binary divides between who's good at what and who's going to pursue certain careers or not. We also have these ideas of emotionality and rationality, where a Nobel Prize winner actually said, a prominent scientist a few years ago at a conference, that the problem with women is that in a lab, and he was talking in a lab situation, but equally applies to any other tech or science domain, that the problem with women is that they fall in love or something like that, they cry when they're put into pressure. So this idea that the women can't handle pressure, that or of a high pressure domain like technology perhaps, is also the root cause of that. So I think there's a lot that we can do about changing cultures within organization, within societies, and having these conversations not just within these rooms, but outside that as well, I think.
I think I'm building a bit on one of your points, Karen. As you were talking, I was thinking of how some profession, one profession I know about is veterinary medicine. And veterinary medicine is interesting because it's from a gender perspective, because it went from being a highly masculinized profession to a highly feminized profession in a very short period of time. And so it created a really good experiment for asking, does a significant shift in the gender profile of a profession change its ethos? And the findings were quite mixed. It was not the case that more women meant that the profession changed. In many cases, a lot of research found women were just practicing a profession in a way that had been masculine. And so I think that gets at the idea that there's a lot of women and men who are concerned with the particular form of masculinity that's being baked into AI right now. Because that's hard to change once it gets really baked in.
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with that. I think that it's not, lots of cultures that are promoted in workplaces is this idea that there are certain way to be authoritative, to be professional. And so women often face this kind of double bind bias, that they have to subscribe to those kind of behaviors and attitudes in order to fit in. Otherwise, they encounter stereotype threat, where they come in with lots of anxiety and they feel that they are not going to fit in a domain. So it is not as much about whether women are designing or how many women are there, which is an important point for me, but also about how we change the culture as such.
One space I think is interesting in this, though, and it's a little bit of adjacency, but it makes sense in my mind to mention it. So globally, we know that 1 in 5 data centers have not a single woman working in them. And the UK have designated this as critical infrastructure. And I've had some really interesting conversations with folk about how can we have critical infrastructure where there are data centres there is not a single woman working there. How do we start that change, and what would that mean for the culture in those data centres where you are often having to work shift work? Sometimes that is lone working in specific parts of the data centre. And then I imagine some of your minds are going to the next question of why that is a problem space. And actually, I think that speaks to even, and I've had this conversation with policymakers, because there's this hesitancy of going, well, we can't really do it, because it would mean we would need to do something like a cohort of women so that they're safe. And I think I would love to expand that conversation, because it speaks to so much that we're talking about gender, and something that we need. We're building more data centres in the UK. This is a really important area that we have, a resilient skills landscape. But we are, at a policy level, fearful of potentially having deeper conversations, because to start with an all-male workforce and bring a single woman into that, there is a question mark on it. And I think that to me is a landscape that actually would be very useful to explore with some decision makers about why they're so hesitant and how that plays out in what we're seeing in society as well. And to speak to both of yours kind of points on that wildly different views that we're seeing in sort of presentation with men. But yeah, that still absolutely blows my mind.
Let's take a couple of questions online, and then I will come back to the room, just to make sure that we do include our audience who's watching.
The first question is from Georgia, a Year 12 student from North London. Do you believe the gender pay gap can ever be eliminated if inherent biological differences will continue to exist?
I don't think your microphone was on there.
Shall I repeat that?
Yes, please.
So this question is from Georgia, who is online, a Year 12 student from North London. Do you believe the gender pay gap can ever be eliminated if inherent biological differences will continue to exist? And the second question is from an aspiring PhD student. What are some key areas that you think future feminist researchers should focus on with regards to AI?
Great questions. Gender pay gap.
What a Year 12 student. I don't know where the camera is, but you're now my favourite. Oh my goodness, what a lovely question. It's a tough one though, because
we're all wearing black.
The big point there is around maternity leave and how we see progression of shared parental leave and actually a wider cultural change around support in the household. Do I think that we can get to gender parity? I do believe so. I think a lot of it, actually, we could get very close. We could get very close quite quickly if we actually put some intention and consistency behind it. There's so much of the problem space is because we continue to have a permissive landscape around the ambiguity. There's still many folk who are contractually bound not to talk about their salary with colleagues. So, when we bind people in that way, it's difficult to even move the dial. But I've seen organisations make enormous jumps forward when they make those intentional changes. So I do think it is possible. I think what we need as a kind of country, we need to think differently about how we support parents within our society. I think it's a really difficult landscape for parents to navigate. There is enormous amount of pressure from every sort of side on this, and I know that's something we were talking briefly about before we came on. But I don't think that is, for me, the roadblock that it needs to be. But it would take quite a lot of a change in societal thinking for us to get there. But I think there's still a ton of lazy behaviour around gender pay gap, and I often go to war on this with organisations who say, it's very hard and we just don't have any senior women and we can't find anyone at all. And I'm like, really? Really?
Can I just add quickly? I think gender pay gap will exist as long as these biological differences are seen as an indication of difference in skill and aptitude,
Yeah, for sure.
and those kind of norms that are still embedded in our society, and the perception that women and men are inherently capable of different things or they do different work. As long as we have motherhood penalty and motherhood bias, which is a real thing, and it leads on from your response or comment about how we still expect. And I think it's a vicious cycle because of the gender pay gap. Often it is the women who are expected to take longer break from work, and it's expected that they are the ones who are going to look after the baby and leave work because they are earning less. And so when they go back into work, they've already stalled their careers, they earn even lesser than that, and childcare is so expensive. So it becomes like a vicious cycle. But I think biological differences are not the root cause for gender pay gap. It is the gendered perceptions and norms in society that are the root of gender pay gap.
Okay. And I think Carrie's going to speak to the question about research.
Well, good luck in pursuing the PhD. Wonderful idea. And I guess I think if I were to quickly sort of sum up how I think techno-feminist research in this area would develop, it would be not starting with AI as a tool, but starting by asking, how does it work? And how does it work? Where? With whom? On what? To get into the nitty-gritty specifics and out of this hype rhetoric is where I think techno-feminist science would take us.
Yeah.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so let's take 3. So I can see that hand there, here with the blue jumper, and here, down here, yeah. So here, and then one more, the woman here who had her hand up earlier, yeah. Okay. If you can all be quite quick, please, because we don't have long.
Yeah, hi. So my name is David. I work here at the LSE as a part-time guest lecturer, but I'm also a data scientist at the Economist Group. So my question revolves around, from a technical perspective, from an engineering perspective, I'm an engineer. So how can I get better at understanding, I guess, the social implications of AI and getting that mindset of kind of like learning more about like the social impact of the technology that I built? I feel like my training in general is very kind of technical, very kind of cold, very isolationist by nature. And I sometimes myself and my peers, when I talk to them, find understanding these social issues a bit more kind of quite hard. So I guess I want to get your opinion on what do you think would be the best way to approach this and get more educated.
And it was, yeah?
It's funny you say that. I was thinking the same thing, but from the other point of view. I'm Anna, a data scientist, work for Acuity Analytics, a consultancy. Every story that you said, I thought, I know this because I'm in the field, I'm in the middle of it, I'm in the AI, I'm in the data, and I'm looking around at all of the men in every room thinking, what on earth is going on?
Yeah.
And you tell of stories and case studies and statistics, but what do you say to the people who are the people in those rooms? How do you persevere in an industry which is not very friendly, that you think every year, maybe it's my last year? There's so much cool stuff happening. You know, we got into it because it's fun and it's exciting. How do you sort of stay resilient in that space?
Okay, great
What's
question.
the practical advice?
Yes. And the final question.
Christine Chow, Emeritus Governor of the LSE. I come from an investor perspective, so quite different from these questions that might have been raised that focus on specific cases. So investors really want to know how companies measure the biases, whether it's gender or age or others. And a few years ago, I think it started with Google, it talks about having a model card that documents what kind of input and risk and processes and have version control. But it seems like that with the expansion and the explosion of different types of AI, this is no longer valid. What would you recommend as a way of documenting the systems and the inputs and the whole life cycle that is going to be useful for stakeholders to understand how to address biases over time?
Okay, so investment life cycle, learning and resilience, and we've got our 2 minutes left.
You need to read the Lovelace report, because there is a whole section that I want you to hand to your employers. Karen Blake. So let's connect, because there's networks. Don't leave. We need you. You're counted in. And there is plenty we can do to make sure that your career, and that might not be with your current employer, your career is successful. You have value. Sorry, I had to answer that one.
Yes.
There we go.
I think for your question about, I think there is a huge crisis about humanities and social science in this country. We need more funding for humanities, and this is why we need more interdisciplinary studies. So I suppose you are here. There's always lots of research material you can read online. I think it's a matter of educating yourself and educating your peers, and maybe joining some groups and reading groups and study groups and having these conversations and mobilizing a community. I think it's about doing it yourself in a kind of a DIY way. And
try to connect with people outside of your echo chamber.
Yeah, exactly.
So, every person that you meet or any view that you see that that piques your curiosity as well, connect with them on places like LinkedIn, follow their content, read books that are outside of your comfort zone. So I just say that as well. I'm not good at being quiet.
The documenting question, the closest I've gotten so far to this in terms of research, I don't know how this would translate, would be to actively use the systems to see how their infrastructure gets embedded into the findings, which is, it's hard. If I could, turn this into a product, but I can't. I think right now, the only way to get at the way in which the systems are leaving a mark on what we're finding is by using them and testing them for that.
Yeah, I think it's a proof of concept, and also a lot, as Karen, I think, mentioned, and there is this drive towards putting out new technology. The whole Silicon Valley culture or tech culture, which I've been talking to quite a lot of people, is this push towards investment, create something new, put it out there. There is no time for it to be studied. There's no time for slowness. There's no time for bringing in humans into it, even having some kind of pilot study to see who is going to use it, where should it be used, what are the regulations and boundaries we need around it, what are the problems, how is it going to be used. For instance, the Meta glasses, they just brought it out, it's huge investment, and now it's being used for violence and perpetuating violence against women. So they're not thinking about the implications or the impact of technology, and I think we need to slow down, a little bit.
Look at social returns on investment as well. There's loads of great frameworks that we could adopt in a way that would help us just reframe some of our longitudinal thinking about harms. That would be my other side.
I don't really want to end on the word harms, but we have to. Thank you very much, everyone in the room, for coming and your questions, and online. Thank you.